welcome to this episode of the Maza's Musings podcast. Today we have a very special episode that's going to be all about Dr. Seuss and most specifically about how the Grinch Stole Christmas. Of course, we are in that holiday time where this just seemed like such an appropriate thing, especially with this podcast being located and headquartered basically in Springfield, Massachusetts, which was the home of Theodor Geisel, also known as Dr. Seuss. I want to thank Barbara Shaffer, who's a local Springfield historian, for some of the background information that she gave us that we're going to talk about Ted's upbringing in Springfield, and a little bit about the background and how that may have influenced some of his works. And then we have a very special conversation with Brian J. Jones, who is a New York Times best-selling biographer and the author of Becoming Dr. Seuss, Theodor Geisel and the Making of an American Imagination. So, we have a lot to get through in this episode, but of course, I would be remiss if we did not first do a Maza's Mickey Minute.
Donald, wake up! It's showtime! Don't forget the orchestra!
Ah, there you are. And just in time.
Mom says there's even more magical stuff now.
For those of you standing, please hold on to the handrails throughout our journey and stay clear of the doors.
Hang on to them hats and glasses, because this here's the wildest ride in the wilderness.
And here we go!
All right, so this week's Maza's Mickey Minute, I just wanted to make note of today when we are recording this portion of the episode. It is December 17th, and that is the first day that the new Island Tower at Disney's Polynesian Villas and Bungalows is now open. So, this is the first day that people are able to stay at this. They've been able to book it for a little while. This is obviously a new Disney Vacation Club specific space. But I've been reading about this and seeing some of the concept art and seeing some of the pictures that are coming out, and it looks really great. So this is from the Disney Parks blog. I'm just going to go through this very quickly just to give you a little bit of a sense of what this place is going to be all about. Located along the stunning shores of the Seven Seas Lagoon, the new tower will celebrate the vibrant spirit of the Polynesian islands, the natural elements, and our favorite wayfinder, Moana. With over 260 beautifully designed rooms, stunning interior spaces, and brand new amenities, the waterfront expansion will become a new home for Disney Vacation Club members and guests to create new vacation memories. So this is just, that's a little bit of corporate speak and everything like that. But if you haven't had a chance to take a look at this, I suggest that you take a look at some of the pictures and some of the artwork. And I think it's really stunning. Some people have been a little leery about it. They think that it's a little simplistic in the design and in the decor. But I think that it was really thought out. And you can see some of these profiles about this new space. They really talk about how thoughtful they were in the theming. So I encourage you to check it out before you just make a snap judgment by looking at a couple of pictures. Really take the time to look into what these people went into these people's thought process in putting this whole thing together. So that is this week's Maza's Mickey Minute. And of course, if you are interested in taking a vacation to Disney World, look no further than your friends at We Do Travel Right. Because We Do Travel Right offers that concierge level service that includes one-on-one support from an agent, the dining team, seminars and study halls to help you understand how to navigate the parks and all things Disney World, because it can be a little confusing and it's unlike most other vacationing experiences. The best thing about all of it is it's free. You can go to wedotravelright.com/Maza to get a free, obligation-free quote. And all of the services that you'd get thereafter are free because you are paying, whether you use an agent or not, you're paying for the use of an agent when you book a Disney resort, Disney stay, or a trip to Universal, or on a cruise line, or if you go to an all-inclusive. All of those places build the price of an agent into their pricing. So you're paying for the agent whether you use it or not. So doesn't it just make sense to use an agent? Like I said, you want your free quote? Go to wedotravelright.com/Maza. That's wedotravelright.com/MAZA and get your next magical vacation started today.
Well, I can't do any more damage around this popsicle stand.
So long, partner.
See you real soon.
Yes, Mickey, you will see us soon. It's getting close. The Disney family, or excuse me, the Maza family's next Disney vacation. By the time you're listening to this podcast, we are within the 60 days. So it'll be, it's coming down to it. It's going to be a great trip. We have used We Do Travel Right to help us with our dining reservations and securing our park tickets. So I'm not just talking about them as someone who, who's looking to help out a friend, because Emily is a friend of mine. But I'm someone who uses the services. So I encourage you to do the same. All right, now getting into our main topic of the week. I'm very excited about this. As I said before, we are located in Springfield, Massachusetts. Springfield is the home of, it's the birthplace of a lot of things, including basketball, including the first gas-powered automobiles, the first American gas-powered automobiles, the first American dictionary was first published in Springfield, Massachusetts, and we are the birthplace of Theodor Geisel, who is Dr. Seuss. So before we get into our main interview for this week, which is with Brian J. Jones, I wanted to give people kind of a little bit of a feel of Ted's upbringing and how he ended up, ended up with some of the inspiration, because he drew. It's presumed that he drew a lot of his inspiration from the area where he grew up. And there are a lot of parallels when you look at the books. And if you've ever been to this area or you live in this area, you'll see in the books and you'll be like, oh yeah, this is kind of like this. So there's a lot of that. And I wanted to just kind of go through so that people got an understanding of Ted's upbringing. And then we'll get into the discussion with Brian, which is all about the book itself, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and its kind of impact and where it stands in Dr. Seuss's literary legacy. Whoa, that's harder to say than you'd think. So we're going to get right into the information that local historian Barbara Shaffer gave to me. This is almost all of this information that I'm giving you came from her, so I want to thank her very much for taking the time to kind of detail some of this stuff for me. We will also have a few images so that you can kind of place some of this stuff, whether you live locally or if you don't, it can just kind of give you a picture of kind of the area that Dr. Seuss was growing up in. So we will get right to that. Just give me a second to... If you are watching this either on Spotify or YouTube, you'll be able to see some of these photos and things that I'm bringing up. Otherwise, I'm going to try to keep it as verbal as possible, so that I'm not just saying, "Hey, look at this picture," so that everybody will be able to get the full idea here. So we are now talking about Theodor Geisel, who was born in the city of Springfield, most likely at his grandparents' home on Howard Street. And they were German immigrants who ran a bakery on the corner of Howard and Main Street in Springfield. Ted's mother, Henrietta, actually secretly eloped out of state in the summer of 1902 with Ted's dad, Theodor Geisel, who was the son of a Springfield brewer. Now, this was pretty controversial at the time, and they didn't tell friends that they had been married for roughly 6 months. So Theodor Geisel, the German patriarch of the Geisel family, was a jeweler in the old country who worked briefly at a gold chain factory in the south end of the city. And then he eventually partnered with Christian Kalmbach to buy a small brewery. Kalmbach and Geisel produced beer that became tremendously popular and sparked the popular phrase, "Come back and guzzle." The Geisel empire included downtown's Highland Hotel, where German cuisine and brews were a specialty. And it's said that during Prohibition, the townhouse in the Highland was occupied by the hotel manager, where he stored 2 truckloads of adult beverages, which were eventually cleared out in a federal raid. Today, there's a restaurant in Springfield called the Student Prince that still has some of the recipes from the old Highland Hotel. So getting back to Ted's childhood, when he was 2 years old, his parents bought a house in the Forest Park neighborhood of Springfield. And that house, which is on Fairfield Street, is still there to this day. The house was sold after Ted's father's death in 1968, but in I believe 2015, I believe the Springfield Museum System purchased the home to preserve it. Now, Ted attended Sumner Avenue School in Springfield, which at the time was new. It's still there to this day. It is certainly not a new school at this point. But his father was the park commissioner at Forest Park, which meant he helped oversee the activities at Forest Park. And he later became the superintendent of the zoo in Forest Park, which undoubtedly was an inspiration to Ted's book, If I Ran a Zoo. Now, Ted is said to have spent many hours sketching the animals at this zoo. Now, the Forest Park Zoo still exists to this day, but not in the form that you'll see it. If you're not watching on YouTube right now, there's a photo of a lion behind bars, and it's very much not that kind of zoo anymore. It's actually a great place where they take in animals. A lot of them were injured and cannot return to the wild. So if you are in the area and are checking out Forest Park, I do encourage you to check out the zoo. And moving on, Ted and his older sister Marnie attended what was at the time Central High School, which was later known as Classical High School, on State Street, which was right across from the Springfield Central Library. Well, Marnie was the scholar and Ted was not. You might think that that's funny for an author, but I feel like you find this a lot with a lot of creatives, that they don't fit into the normal structure that school or something like that would provide. It's said that he would play hooky to watch movies at the Bijou Theater, which was on Worthington Street in Springfield, but he also spent time at the library. He actually spent more time at the library than he did in school. This was because he had a bad experience with an art teacher who taught him rules that he didn't think were worthy of being followed. He also took piano lessons with an instructor at Court Square, Now, Court Square is right on Main Street in downtown Springfield, and there used to be a bookstore in the area on Main Street called Johnson's Bookstore. And to this day, the Johnson's Bookstore building is still there. The bookstore doesn't exist anymore, but Johnson's Bookstore would be the reward for Ted if he performed well in his lessons. His mother would take him to the bookstore. Now, of course, we mentioned the zoo, or the zoo at Forest Park, but Forest Park overall is, I mean, some public officials who I won't name at this point, but they've called it the gem of the city, and it truly is a very beautiful park. But it's also probably served as the inspiration for a lot of things in Dr. Seuss stories. Not the least of which is the Barney Mausoleum, which is just this really, really unique piece of architecture. It is actually the final resting place of Everett Barney, who was the inventor of the clamp-on ice skates, and he actually owned the land that was donated to become Forest Park. So he and his wife are still their remains are in this mausoleum, and it's just such interesting architecture. It's got these curving staircases, and there's a sphinx guarding it. And so, you've seen some of these things or similar things in some of his literary works. There are also a lot of unique rustic outbuildings, and there was even once a section called Geisel's Grove. So, with all of that, it's really cool to kind of see where and how Ted grew up. It seems like, a lot of times these figures that we've grown up with kind of have this larger than life kind of feel to them. I talked with Dan Caterio when he visited the Disney Hometown Museum in Marceline, that these kinds of things are interesting because they kind of humanize the person, that we know. And especially with Dr. Seuss having, he had his real name, and then he had Dr. Seuss, his pen name. So there was kind of this added layer to Dr. Seuss. So that I thought it was really important to kind of give people kind of a sense that this was a kid who grew up very much the way that a lot of other kids did during that time. He was a kid who played hooky to go to the movies, and his father had some interesting jobs, and his father was also someone who shifted between jobs because his father owned a brewery, and then Prohibition happened, and so I just think that grounding him a little bit is important context to the conversation that we have coming up with Brian, which we'll get to right now. Well, for this segment of this episode, we are joined by New York Times bestselling biographer Brian J. Jones, who is who has he's had a number of books, a number of titles that are all really interesting subjects, and one of the titles, of course, is Becoming Dr. Seuss, Theodor Geisel, and the Making of an American Imagination. So, Brian, usually at this point, I give guests the opportunity to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their background. And so if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, and anything else you'd like to mention, take it away.
Sure. As you said, my name is Brian J. Jones. I have been a biographer, historian, pop culture dork, at least professional pop culture dork, since about 2006. I mean, my first book came out in 2008, so and I started writing that in 3 or so, and that was a biography of Washington Irving, who was actually sort of our first pop culture celebrity, really fascinating guy who I had no idea until I started looking into it, how fascinating he was. But after Washington Irving, I kind of own everyone's childhood. I've written biographies of Jim Henson, George Lucas, and Dr. Seuss. So sort of no matter how old you are, I think I've got you at some point there with your childhood. So I always consider that sort of the these creative American icons. All men with beards, as someone pointed out to me as well. So not deliberate. But Seuss was a project that I worked on for about 4 years, starting right after the George Lucas came out in 2016, and Seuss came out in 2019, and I'd been working on the Seuss book for about a year when the Lucas book came out. So it's, I sort of pride myself on doing deeply researched books, with or without people who will or will not talk to me. And of course, Seuss's wife, his second wife, would not talk to me while I was working on this book. But, I think even if you've read up on Dr. Seuss, or you know some things about Dr. Seuss, I hope you'll find stuff in that biography that maybe you'd never heard before. Learn some things you'd never heard before, maybe get an appreciation for some of his work you'd never seen before. Because that was really one of the things I love about my subjects, and one of the things I always want people to understand is just how many balls these guys have in the air at any given time. They're just constantly, it's exhausting. They're just constantly working on projects. I mean, it's not just genius in these guys, it's this really incredible work ethic. And Seuss was one of these guys who, similar to Lucas, George Lucas, who hated writing, made himself sit down every day when he was working on a script. And Seuss had this lifelong habit of going and sitting at the desk every morning at 9 o'clock or so, and sitting there until 5 o'clock in the evening, whether anything had gone down on the page or not. He was determined to work. So, a lot of his story is about just putting in the time and doing the work. Which I think is really, really inspiring, especially for, anybody who's a creative, and it's just like, God, I don't know. I sit and I stare at the canvas and nothing happens. Seuss stared at the campus and nothing happened. Canvas stared at the canvas and nothing happened an awful lot. So I think if you're out there and you're like, the words just aren't coming, the pen isn't drawing, take comfort in knowing that creators like Seuss had the exact same problems.
Now, so this is kind of a good segue into my first question here is, Dr. Seuss was already a bit established when he wrote How the Grinch Stole Christmas, but if you could just provide a little bit of perspective on where he was in his literary literary life at that point.
Yeah.
Where was he, and what? Obviously, you have multiple projects in the air, but what? Just so we have a little perspective as to where he was in his journey at that point.
Sure. So when The Grinch is published, Seuss is 53 years old. He, it's so hard to believe because most of us know him as, already in tall, towering stone letters, Dr. Seuss. At the time this book came out, Seuss he was a well-known children's author. Didn't have a whole lot of books to his name yet. I can't remember the exact count, but not a lot of big ones. And a lot of the books that you since know, he hasn't even written yet. But 1957 is when The Grinch comes out, and it's a bellwether year for Seuss because he has two huge iconic books that hit that year. He has The Cat in the Hat, which comes out, I think, in April or sometime in the spring, and then he has The Grinch comes out at Christmas. So just a gigantic, iconic year for Seuss. He hadn't really had years like that before. One of the things that's fascinating about him is, Seuss's books did okay up until that point, but he never really earned enough to write full time. He was an advertising man. He'd made his career doing advertising, where he was the Don Draper of his generation, had this knack for coming up with sort of pithy taglines and things like that, and drawing. He did a lot of work for Esso and for Standard Oil and bug spray and things like that, and made his living primarily that way. He was also a script fixer in Hollywood and really got fed up with Hollywood. At one point after World War II, he thinks he might be able to make a career out of that, and just gets really disgusted by all the suits that have to inject themselves into the process, something that also happened to George Lucas, but just decides that he's just not cut out for Hollywood and is going back to doing children's books. And, Cat in the Hat is his is his big book. That's the book that makes him, because, and that's an entirely separate conversation, but what makes that book so important was that was a children's book that had a pedagogy behind it, which is the first time that it really happened. I mean, it was what they called a primer, like the Dick and Jane reader. But unlike Dick and Jane, so the vocabulary in that book was educator approved. But Seuss was the first one who figured out how to kind of make it fun. And so that book just sold like crazy. And then he hits again with the Grinch in the Christmas around November. I think that year is when it comes out. So just lightning in a bottle, great year for Seuss. But up until that time, couldn't really do it full time until these books come out. And now he can sort of move on and start becoming the Seuss we think of. Cat in the Hat sends him in an entirely different direction, doing children's books with vocabularies that are, again, educator approved. So that's what made a lot of those books. It made him so important. But like I said, up until this time, he's 53 when this book comes out, which is just, I'm 57. And you're like, great, I can't, life does begin at 50, I guess. So, it's great that you see Seuss like finally hitting it. He'd been doing what he liked for a long time, but this is finally the moment he's able to kind of sit down and do it full time and put all that other, underbrush, if you will, aside and concentrate solely on being a children's author. But this is the two big, most beloved Seuss books come out in the same year, which is just incredible.
Now, so what was the inspiration? Ted Seuss often seems to have taken some of his personal experiences and the world around him and implemented it into his works. Was this the case with How the Grinch Stole Christmas? What was there an everyday inspiration that ended up launching this fantastical tale?
Maybe. And I know a number of writers have tried to take it on and trying to read things into it and so on. You always have to be a little careful with Seuss on things like that. How much is deliberate message and how much is coincidence and how much is just him being funny. He can be a really unreliable narrator, which makes him really fun and sometimes frustrating to write about. You're trying to find the BS behind a lot of his stories sometimes. One of the stories Seuss told was about how he looked in the mirror, I think the day after Christmas or the day before Christmas, and didn't know what this was looking back at him and said, oh my God, it's Seuss looking back at me, and realized he'd sort of become Grinchy about Christmas and had to kind of rediscover what he himself had lost in becoming sort of cynical about it or just crabby in the trappings of it. I think one of the really interesting angles on it, and this is me speculating, which is what, we sometimes as biographers get to do. We try not to speculate too much, but, the message of the Grinch is that Christmas doesn't come from the store, that you can't buy things. But Seuss, up until that point, has spent a lot of his career trying to convince you to buy things that come from a store.
Sure.
And so I don't know if maybe this is Seuss, sort of reckoning with himself and his role in capitalism and commercialism and things like that, and making a little commentary on that. It does that Christmas can be a little bit, made a little bit more. So again, I don't know if that's deliberate or not, but it's certainly I think a fair interpretation of that. His only official story on that was he looked at himself in the mirror and went, ugh. Who is that? And found out, once it was him, that he had sort of Grinched out. Seuss always said all his life that the Grinch was the one character he related to the most. He talked about, people would ask him if you could have the Cat in the Hat and the Grinch at the party, who would you invite to dinner? And he was like, oh my God, the Grinch, and Seuss drove the license plate on his car was Grinch, for the rest of his life. So I think that says a lot about how he regarded that character as sort of a character that had redeemed himself. And I think maybe Seuss saw, really like that message of redemption as well with the Grinch.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm coming to you from Springfield, Massachusetts, and so there are a lot of people talk a lot about tie-ins with the stories or with illustrations, like Mulberry Street. There's Mulberry Street in Springfield that people draw. Like he used to ride on the brewery carriage with his father down Mulberry Street, which at the time was was a pretty affluent street. And there's even there's a local town called East Hampton that is at the base of a mountain that they claim themselves as Whoville, and Mount Tom being Mount Crumpet.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about that in the book. I think I even opened with that, and it was sort of an epiphany I had sitting in an airport coming back from Springfield, because I'm sure everybody on especially who live on Mulberry Street, get this. You probably have tourists like driving down that street really slow and ask you, where does Dr. Seuss live? And was like, well, he actually lived over on Fairfield. But there is a Mulberry, and I said something like, people are disappointed in finding out that Seuss didn't live on Mulberry Street as they are, and finding out there's no 221B Baker Street. There's a bank there now. But Seuss could always lift little elements. And I can't remember who it is, but there's in the cemetery, there's sort of a monument to, I think, the guy who built the first ice skates, who's buried there. And it looks like a Seussian sort of, there's stairwells and curlicues and things. That's certainly something he would have seen and probably been impressed with. So, and across the street from where his parents' bakery was, I think is the Armory, which is still there, which looks like Bartholomew Cubbins, and it looks like a lot of other, it's got very Seussian architecture. So yeah, I mean, you draw what you know, for sure. And Springfield, even if it's not literally that, I mean, definitely inspired a lot of that. So it's funny, when I wrote about Washington Irving, and I have every community in upstate New York swears to me they're the actual Sleepy Hollow, even though there actually is a Sleepy Hollow. So everybody likes, to really get a hold of sort of that iconography around there. Now, Springfield can legitimately claim that, but it's, how much of it is literal and how much of it is influencing him, sometimes hard to say.
So you mentioned that this was one of two stories that really vaulted Dr. Seuss into a much more prominent literary role. What was it? What do you think resonated with people about this story, and what helped him cement his place in children's literature with this story, along with The Cat in the Hat?
So I think with the Grinch, I mean, it just kind of, I think people do love that redemption arc with the Grinch, and I think everybody has felt like every aspect of the Grinch one time or not, especially around the holidays. I think that's one of the reasons adults really liked it. And that really was always Seuss's superpower. Later on, was kids loved his books. They were fun to read. They rhyme, the rhyme is great. Teachers loved them because, again, with The Cat in the Hat, you've got an educator-approved vocabulary list. Now, Grinch doesn't have that. Grinch was what he was called the big books later on that didn't have to adhere to that vocabulary. But you've got a book that's, bionic, because parents don't mind reading The Grinch to their kid, because The Grinch is a great book. And because I think, again, parents, along with Seuss, have seen The Grinch in the mirror some mornings, and like that redemption arc, and I think can relate to every emotion that The Grinch kind of goes through, even in that book, even he was being a complete, a complete jerk and stealing everything. And then at the end brings it all back. So I think that's one of the reasons parents could relate to it on different levels, and kids just thought it was funny. And, and Seuss's rhyme really always keeps you coming back on both of those books. One of the things that I just love about Seuss, and for me, it was interesting because my relationship with him was very different than it was with, say, Jim Henson and George Lucas. Cause I was a Star Wars kid. I was 9 the summer the Star Wars came out, and grew up Sesame Street Generation 1. Most people will tell me I learned to read with Dr. Seuss. I did not. I learned how to read. My mother, as she always says, Mother of the Year, handed my brother and I, Mad Magazine paperbacks and things like that. And that was what we were kind of reading. And Seuss to me was the dentist office book. I would see those books at the dentist. And so I never had them at home, but I always loved going to, it was the one, I would love going to the dentist because I'm like, oh, I can read Bartholomew Cubbins, or I could read Seuss books. So I had a very different relationship with him on these books. And so that was when I was sort of fascinated watching him go along on the process of this. But something like Cat in the Hat is a book that parents love to read as well. But where I started that with his rhyme scheme. So I got to go back and read all of his books fresh, because I had not really read a lot of them growing up. And what's incredible about him, and when you read The Grinch and when you read Cat in the Hat, but read The Grinch out loud, and notice as a parent, while you're reading this out loud, you never have to say a word in a weird way to make it fit the rhyme. You never have to put a stress on a word. It's, Seuss writes refrigerator, not refrigerator, or refrigerator, or what, you never have to say a word weird to make it fit the rhyme scheme. Seuss was very deliberate about that. And he would put his pages up on the wall of his office, and tape them, and he would stare at them, and he would even look at them. And let's say that the rhyme scheme was perfect. If he stepped back from the wall and looked at it, and he would say, that line's just too long, it doesn't look right on the page, he would go back and start again. to get the rhyme that wasn't that the sentence wasn't quite as long. Maybe you had to pick a completely different word. He always compared it to unknitting a sock when that happened, because you had to kind of go back and refit everything. But I think that's one of the reasons too, is like to our ear, and especially to the American ear, Seuss is a little hard to translate in other languages. Seuss, Grinch doesn't have too many weird words in it, but I mean, to the American ear, you don't have to struggle to make the rhymes work. And I think that's one of the reasons his books are so effortless as a read, even as a parent and his kids. So that's a long roundabout way of saying that he's doing a lot of things right in The Grinch that people hadn't really done before. And there were some sort of Christmas classics around at that time, but The Grinch is sort of one of the big brand new Christmas stories. There's references to Santa, but it doesn't really involve any of those characters, that goes mainstream. And so it's just, nobody had ever seen this thing coming. And it actually debuts in a magazine, which all of a sudden I can't think of. Redbook. Debuts in Redbook. And one of the questions I love to ask people is, tell me what color the Grinch is. And everybody says, well, what color is the Grinch there, Chris? He's green.
He's green.
Go back and read the Grinch. Pick up the copy of the Grinch. He is not colored at all. The only color Seuss uses in Grinch is red, in varying shades of it to do different things. It's on the Santa suit, it's in the Grinch's eyes, and so on. The green doesn't come, and we can talk about this as well. The green doesn't come until Chuck Jones picks it for the Grinch cartoon. But it's just so cool how iconic that, because of course the Grinch is green, but right. Seuss hadn't even thought about that part of the story. He was working in only the one color, the red. Because it was cheaper to produce the book that wasn't full color. So Seuss was very picky about what color he was going to use. And I think because you've got the Grinch's eyes and you've got the Santa suit things, he chose red for that book, not a green.
So we're there. So why don't we keep going with the television special? Now, this was, on top of everything else, something that, from what I understand, he was pretty reluctant about at first. Yeah. And I'd imagine that experience with Hollywood probably had a lot to do with that.
Yeah. The Hollywood suits, the one big movie to his name is the 5,000 Fingers of, oh my God, all of a sudden I want to say Bartholomew Cubbins, but I can't remember what it's called, but it's the one that he wrote, and it just left a really horrible experience with, like, way too many hands on the script. Why can't I think of the name of that? That's so embarrassing. But way too many hands on the script, way too much interference from the higher ups, just left a really bad taste in his mouth for Hollywood and for things. Now, Seuss, when he had been in the Army, he was in the Army Signal Corps and was stationed stateside and had done a lot of promotional films for the Army, a lot of safety training films. Mm-hmm. He's the one that did the Private Snafu films. And he had enjoyed his experience there working with Hollywood, but the Hollywood he was working with at that time was over at Warner Studios, and the primary contact for him was a young animator named Chuck Jones. So Seuss had this relationship with Chuck Jones going into it, and that's really what makes The Grinch possible, because Seuss is so skeptical of this. And Jones wants to adapt. I think he's sort of given carte blanche to do what he wants, and he considers doing Cat, but no, he really wants to do The Grinch. And he cannot get Seuss to show up. So he takes the mountain to Muhammad and drives out to the mountain that Seuss lives on out in California, and to go meet with him to discuss this. And Seuss is still very skeptical, and he meets with Chuck Jones, and his wife Helen is with him, who's really important to Seuss's story. She's sort of his first reader and has really good instincts on story and things like that. And she's his defender, it's Seuss's defender as well. So she's very skeptical of this. And as Chuck Jones is spooling out the story of how he wants to do this and how he wants to let Seuss be involved, and he can write the song. I mean, now his wife is on Chuck Jones' side, still trying to convince him, but he's very skeptical. The ad man's very skeptical on this one, but finally realizes that if you're going to do it, Chuck Jones is probably the right guy to do it. And the other thing I think they get him with is Chuck Jones tells me he can write the songs for it. And Seuss, for some reason, like that always got his attention. And you'll notice a lot of the Seuss cartoon, made for TV cartoons, have all these original songs, and then that he writes the lyrics to. Like, he just loved writing those songs. So I think that was one of the ways they really sweeten that for him. But Jones brings in all these great people to work on the project, and the backgrounds are just just beautifully developed, and nothing is done sort of half-assed on it. And I think that really appealed to him too. I think there are more frames per second in the Grinch cartoon than your standard animation. Again, it was like a little additional care in there to convince Seuss to come on board. So I think had it been anybody other than Chuck Jones, you might not have gotten this project done. He just sort of trusted Jones to not screw it up based on their past that they had.
I'd imagine there's always a challenge too when you're taking what's essentially like a 10-minute read and trying to stretch it out into a 30-minute feature.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that.
Well, and the brilliance of, they never said which one of them came up with it, but the brilliance of the animated version is they play up Max. They make Max sort of the audience's perspective in a way. He's sort of the every dog in that. And Max in the book, was constantly sort of reacting to things, but he's not playing the sort of part he is.
Sure.
So that was a really smart thing to do, to stretch that out, and adding the song stretches it out too. And it never feels padded, which is also really hard to do. But like fleshing out that character of Max, I think was really smart. I think that's one of the things people really love about that cartoon, which is why, again, when you do the live action Grinch, you better make sure you take care of Max in there as well, because that's the character, even though in the book he's not doing as much, the audience really insists on him now. They really want to see it from Max's point of view. Pulling that sleigh with that antler tied to his head and stuff. So that was a brilliant little conceit they did, is sort of putting it through the eyes of Max. But Seuss would go out every day to meet with Chuck Jones, and they would go over, picking that color. They joked that was the color of every rental car in Southern California the year they were making that book, making that special, and that was where they picked it. But again, it's another one that's so cool because it seems like it was just laying there hidden in plain sight. Of course, the Grinch is green. And color was always really important to Seuss. Seuss would send in, when he was, doing his books later on, he would always send in pieces of broken crayon to the printers at Random House and be like, this is the purple you have to match in here, and they were like spinning the color wheels trying to find the exact gradation for his colors. Very particular on colors, which again, it's weird that like he hadn't really thought about the color of the Grinch, but of course, why not? That's the color you're going to land on for him. And it pops out, and it's Christmassy. You put him with that red hat on, you've got the Christmas colors right there. But that comes through the cartoon, not through Seuss, which is really fun.
Now, it's years later, and then there's the live action movie, which again, it's strange to stretch a 10-minute read into a full feature-length film. And
you've stretched the book to a cartoon to a movie. Yeah, you've got to constantly figure out the way to like find your spots that you're going to use to flesh it out. Yeah.
But this is all, it's interesting because, the book came out in 1957. The TV special was, 66?
66, I think so, yeah.
And then
I should have looked that up before I got on with it, Chris. Sorry, I didn't check that one. I think that's right.
And then the full-length live action movie was
2003,
2000 something. But it's also, it's finding ways for new generations to connect with the story and maybe reconnect back with the book.
Right. Yeah. And it always takes you back to the source material. I mean, there's a reason that book's perpetually in print. There's a reason it sells like crazy at Christmas. It's sort of like All of the Places You'll Go, which sells like crazy at graduation season. And also stays perpetually. It's a book for anybody who's in motion, changing lives. So that's another one that's perpetually in print and rises to the top of the bestseller list around May every year. But it always takes you back to the source material, and all the versions are are faithful, even as they're extrapolating on the source material. I don't think when you go back, if you watch the Jim Carrey Grinch and then without having read the book and then go back to read the book, you're going to come away going, oh, come on, it doesn't have this part in. I don't think you ever feel that way with the Grinch. You never feel ripped off by that book. One of the things I did want to just mention, I loved, and I called the chapter this about the Grinch. I loved watching, because I had access to some of his original notes when he was developing the Grinch, and he would take out sheets of paper and just get out like black pencil and write all over them, just trying to come up with song lyrics. And he would start to write a sentence, and then he put a long dash where he didn't know what the word was going to be. And I loved watching him developing the Grinch song and figuring out what was worse, like toadstool, is that worse than blackened pickle? And, just watching him come up with like grosser and grosser words, trying to arrive at something that was gross and then trying to get it to work into the rhyme. And I called that chapter Stink, Stank, Stunk, because like he's got that written at the bottom of a page. He knows that's the pay dirt on that one, and he's trying to figure out how to get to it. So it's really fun watching his brain in action and stuff like that. And I tried to get some of that into the book as well. So as you're reading along, it's almost like the musical 1776. Like, they signed the Declaration, but as you're watching, you're like, are they going to get there? And when you're reading that chapter, I hope you're like, God, are they ever going to get this thing done? And they did in spades. It was a huge hit when it came out. It's been a perennial hit ever since then. It's one of those like Charlie Brown Christmas. If people don't get to watch it, they're pissed. Who's carrying it this year is like the beginning of the year. People are like, who's carrying Rudolph? Who's carrying the Grinch? Who's carrying Charlie Brown? Who's carrying A Christmas Story? You're spinning the dial, and now the app's trying to find out who's got what. And the Grinch is always one that people want to see. I don't even know as the Grinch on cartoon now. Who does? Who's got it this year? I haven't even seen it.
I don't know. Yeah, I have it on DVD. So I've got the physical media. So we're always set there.
Absolutely.
Of course, I have a 6-year-old daughter who is terrified of the Grinch right now. So
there's videos all over social media right now of like people dressing as the Grinch and like crashing the kids' Christmas party, and they're all freaking terrified. And why wouldn't they be? Like they're like, isn't going to be cute when like dad comes in dressed as the Grinch, and like they come running in, and every kid gets up shrieking and runs away.
The funny thing is, before we were doing this, I was actually at a Christmas party for a nonprofit that I'm a part of, and we had Santa and we had the Grinch, and the number of kids who were actually like really into the Grinch, and the number of Grinch sweatshirts and Grinch sweaters, it's still a character that resonates to this day. I think the message and the character, certainly, I've been accused of being a Grinch myself, though.
Right.
You can see in the background behind me, I'm very much, there are things about Christmas that I certainly do love, and decorating is one of them. But, I think that what makes this book so great for me is regardless of generation, it resonates.
Yeah. I mean, and isn't it fascinating and interesting that he's like the word Scrooge, the words like you hear that name and you know exactly what that is. You hear the word Grinch, you know exactly what that is. Like Seuss has this knack of picking just like in a way that Dickens kind of did, picking just the right word that, again, it seems like it was always there. And why did no one else ever grab it? Now, Grinch is a word that showed up in some of his earlier work without meaning what it did later. It was but the first time he appeared, it was sort of an oily snake oil salesman. So characteristically, it was kind of the same, personality, although it was a different looking character. But it's just, it's such a great word. And, Seuss often got asked, he got asked, I think it was the Lorax, where did that come from? How did you come up with the drawing of him? And he says, well, I looked at him and he was a Lorax. And, he's being flipped because he really agonized over it, especially in a book like the Lorax that he had to like go on safari to like get back to it. But Grinch is just like, it's a word you hear that word Grinch and we all know what it means. Like Seuss just has that knack for picking the exact right word that seems, again, like it was always there. But if you say, oh, that guy's such a Grinch, and we all know exactly what that means. It's like you tell somebody he's a Scrooge. We all know exactly what that means. So really another really cool thing that Seuss has done.
Now, with just getting back to the book specifically, again, with How the Grinch Stole Christmas and also The Cat in the Hat reaching success, do you think that it influenced the way that he approached his books and his writing going forward, or did he have his process already and it didn't deviate?
Well, he had his process already, but he had to deviate it slightly more so the Cat in the Hat and the Grinch are doing two different things. And the Cat in the Hat, again, as I said at the beginning, why that book was important is it had the educator approved vocabulary list. It's got a pedagogy behind it. The Grinch does not. The Grinch is like, is what he always called the big books. Cat in the Hat's a different size. Grinch is literally a bigger book, but those were his bigger books. But what Cat in the Hat does is spawn an industry at that point. Random House realizes like, this is a huge book. Teachers are buying it. It's going into classrooms. There's a market there for educational children's books that kids want to read. And so Seuss was put in charge of, with his wife and with Bennett Cerf, the head of Random House, his wife Phyllis, who was also brilliant. They were put in charge of the Beginner Books imprint. Man, Cat in the Hat is sort of the first beginner book. And beginner books are, again, very important because they would sit down and they would hire people like the Berenstains come out of the beginner books, the Stan and Jan Berenstain of the Berenstain Bears. When you get ready to write the book, they say, here is your word list. And for, the grade level they were starting off with, it's about 400 words roughly. And you cannot deviate from that list. If you have the word, let's say the word alligator is on the list, if the word alligators is not on the list, you can't just randomly pluralize it. Now they came up with a couple of rules later on how you could pluralize things, but it's like if your verb was missing or a tense of your verb is not on that list, you can't use it. So it's like writing in a straitjacket in a way. And Seuss had talked about just the agony of writing The Cat in the Hat. It took him several years because you couldn't find things there. And he always joked that he said, I'm going to find the first two words that rhyme, and that's going to be the main character finally. And he said cat and hat both rhymed, and he knew that was it. That sounded very simple, but it's like, he had stared at that word list for the better part of a year trying to figure out what his story was. And you can see there's that one moment in Cat in the Hat when he's almost downloading that word list when the cat's on the ball and he's juggling and they're like, there's a man and there's a boat and there's a car and there's a rake and there's, he's just downloading off that word list onto there. But that's what made that book so important. And moving forward, all those books in the beginner book imprint, some of which he wrote, some of which he edited, they all have that pedagogy. And that's when Seuss really takes off. That's when he's in every classroom at that point now. And then, of course, once that starts happening, your backlist starts selling, which as a writer is what you always want. And that's when people started going back and finding again Horton Hatches the Egg, which, had come out post World War II, or Horton Hears a Who, and did okay, but just wasn't selling all the time. Mm-hmm. And once the backlist starts selling, like that's when you can make your living. But every book is getting in the classroom. And one of the stories I told the other day is when I told people I was working on Seuss, people would be like, "Oh my God, I love Go Dog Go! I love Go Dog Go." Go Dog Go is actually edited by Seuss, but not written by him. But it's one of those beginner books that's got that pedagogy behind it. It uses that word list. So that's what's going on. That's sort of the legacy that comes out of Cat in the Hat, is it creates that beginner books label. And then it creates one for younger readers called Bright and Early that has an even tighter word list. And that's where Green Eggs and Ham comes out of, because that book uses only 50 unique words. And Seuss actually won a bet with his publisher. He said, I bet, okay, smart guy, you wrote Cat in the Hat using that little tight word list. I bet you can't use less than 50. And Seuss always said, Bennett Seuss said something, I'll bet you $50 you can't use less than 50 words. And as Seuss said later, he never paid him his $50. but that has a pedagogy behind it. That's sort of, again, that's the legacy of Cat in the Hat. I think the legacy of the Grinch moving forward is that's where you see Seuss starting to sort of let his hair down a little bit, because he's not constricted. I don't know that he appreciated until he started doing Cat in the Hat how liberating it is not to be restricted by a word list. And I think that's where you see him like, I'm not confined by my word list on these big books. I am going to go to town. You don't see quite as many coming at him because that's when he's working on so many of the beginner books. But moving forward, that's where a lot of those really, You're Only Old Once is one of the big books that comes out later, and All the Places You'll Go, and so those were what he always called his big book. Happy Birthday to Me was before that one, but so all the books that you see before the Cat in the Hat were usually what he would call the big books. Happy Birthday to Me and Bartholomew Cubbins and the Horton books. Those are the big books, but those aren't restricted by the vocabulary word list. So from 1907 on, anything that's like the bigger format, the literal big books, those don't have the word list on it, but the smaller ones do. And that's what and nowadays they all call them, I think, beginner books, even what used to be the Bright and Early. But the Grinch, I sort of let him cut loose, and the Grinch comes back later on in TV specials. I think there's one where you even get the Grinch and the Cat in the Hat meet each other on one of them. I think they say something like Halloween is Grinch night, I think is one of them, something like that. So Seuss did keep coming back to that character. He really did have a genuine fondness for the Grinch.
Now, obviously, we have just touched on a sliver of the history that is Dr. Seuss and his legacy. So if people want to learn more, where can they find your book and find you?
Sure. You can find all of this and more in Becoming Dr. Seuss, which is still in print and should be available from your favorite bookseller anywhere online, bricks and mortar. If it's not, have them order it. So, like I said, still in print. Or you can find me online. My website is Brian J. Jones. Spell it out. Otherwise, you're looking for the Dead Rolling Stone. Spell out brianjjones.com. And I'm not over there as much. I'm trying to get back to that now that Twitter's gone to hell. I've been back sort of on my website poking around. I'm on Blue Sky primarily now more than anything else, still under Brian J. Jones. Probably will talk a little bit about the Grinch again this year. And I do like to tell the story about Tell Me What Color He Is. That one's always a big hit with people. And I'll show some of the early illustrations of what the Grinch looked like in his first incarnation when he was just trying to sell someone a piece of string. It was a very different character. So.
Now, you've also had some other books. You mentioned George Lucas and Jim Henson. I did notice on your website you had recently done an update regarding Muppet Vision.
Muppet Vision 3D.
Now, one of the big things that we talk about on this podcast a lot is Disney. We go to Disney World quite a bit. I know I'm kind of blindsiding you. This wasn't on the list of topics, but your thoughts and feelings in a nutshell about what's happening with Muppet Vision 3D and the Jim Henson legacy.
Yeah, I wish I knew more about what Disney's plans were for the Muppet Vision 3D. The family's comments were along the lines of, we know it's moving. We look forward to a bright future or something. So I don't know if there's any indication that they're aware of that the rest of us aren't might be the destiny of this. I wrote a little piece about this on my website, and I think the first thing I said is it's a shame. And it's a shame because it's the last project Jim Henson worked on while he was alive. He was still working on, when Jim was negotiating the sale of his company to Disney, he didn't actually ever really have a contract. They had what he always called sort of a handshake agreement between he and Michael Eisner, who he really trusted. Didn't like Katzenberg too much, but Eisner he was good with. And so he was doing a lot of projects for Disney without really having an agreement in place, including Muppet Vision 3D. And there's moments, if you read the biography, that he was really bickering with them over, how much they were going to pay him as a director. And he fires off. Well, he never sent it. I think his producer talked him down, but just, had this blistering letter he was going to send to Katzenberg along the lines of, if you're going to make me defend my value every single time I come to you, then maybe this isn't the greatest relationship to have. Because they were trying to, nickel and dime him over how much he would be paid as a director for Muppet Vision 3D, which is doing so many cool things. I mean, you had before that, you had Captain EO, which was kind of what they all called the 4D. And Muppet Vision 3D was like that. It was a completely immersive experience. Still a lot of fun today. I think you can. Is it gone now? I think it was there through the end of November. Do you still have a chance to see it?
Muppet Vision? Yeah. I think it's still there. Yeah,
it's still there.
I think we're going in February, and I'm
may still be there.
Crossing my fingers that it'll still be there.
Yeah. So it's it still holds up. It's still very funny. It's still a lot of fun to go see. You still have to have somebody playing Sweetums every 15 minutes come running into the room to the delight of everybody. Still a great piece, and Jim was right about it. And it's just, Jim had a lot of great ideas for that little corner of the park. Disney has tried, I can't tell how hard to bring some of those elements into it. You have Rizzo's Pizzeria, I think, in there now, which, Jim had the idea for a themed restaurant in there where everything went crazy. And he loved the dark rides, and he wanted sort of a Muppet version of the Great Movie Ride where all the information you got was incorrect. Like Jim thought that was hilarious. And just none of it ever came to fruition. And so that Muppet Courtyard, as they call it, has sort of been in stasis, for the last 20 years. And I get it. I understand why Disney, they're like, we have more franchises that are, I don't know that Disney knows what to do with the Muppets right now, to be honest. But they have what they're putting in there is, I think, Monster. I think they're doing Monsters Inc. They're going to Monsters Inc. theme it. So, and I get it. It is a prime piece of real estate in the park. That it's got a lot of foot traffic. It's a pass through. I get it. My hope is that they would put it. I had suggested putting it on Main Street. Where you've got great moments with Mr. Lincoln at Disneyland, and I think they're opening a similar animatronic show with Disney himself for the anniversary. They've already got that sort of, vaudevillian feel to it that would be kind of right at home on Disney Main Street for the theater. Like put them up at theater on Main Street and put the show there on Main Street going there. I don't know. I mean, I'm glad they are retheming the the Rock and Roller Coaster, featuring Aerosmith, which was a bad theming even when they first did it, to make that the Mayhem. I mean, I think that'll work out great. That'll be fun. So I'm glad they're doing that. But I don't know. It's just like every time you get a really great Muppet. I thought the Muppet Mayhem series last year on Disney was fantastic, but they canceled after one season. I don't know that Disney's quite sure what to do with the Muppets yet. I don't know if they have had a change in creative leadership who seems to know a little bit more about how she wants to run the Muppets and what they should be doing. And that might be enough to entice somebody like Frank Oz back, maybe into sticking his toe back in the water. He got away from the Muppets almost entirely. You still got Dave Goelz there doing Gonzo. You've still got all these amazing, talented performers and puppeteers and writers and songwriters. People like Bill Prady, who was writing, I think, parts of Muppet 3D. He's still out there. He still probably wants to get his hands on the Muppets. Craig Shemin, who was worked for Jim. He's a fantastic writer. I mean, there's people out there, I think, who get the Muppets. And Mayhem, the writers of Mayhem, they definitely, it's, I can't think of his name, Jeff. Oh God, they got it. I thought Muppets Mayhem was really fun. Everyone likes to play the game on social media. pick a project and take away every character, but leave one human and the rest are Muppets.
Right.
That's fun. Like I'm always like, I would like to see Murder on the Orient Express that way, maybe. But I mean, the Muppets are so much more than that. And the reason Mayhem worked is it was just Muppet centric. Like they weren't adapting a project; they were just being their own thing, and that can work. And you really need writers that understand that, and that understand that the relationship between the characters is what really matters. When they come pre-packaged with an existing story, it's a little bit different than you do something like the Muppet Movie or the Muppets Take Manhattan, where you're like, you have to make them interact, and it's that relationship that matters so much. And I think there are people who get that, and I think the writers and the creative team behind Muppet Mayhem got that. I'm just really disappointed that Disney didn't renew that. I'm not sure. I mean, it seems like stuff gets canceled before, most of us even had a chance to see stuff anymore. That was one of the great things that happened to the Muppet Show with the Muppet. I mean, the Muppet Show nowadays, if they put it on, it had been canceled midway through the first season. And what happened in 1976 was they just gave it time. You watch the first season of the Muppet Show and you're like, oh my God, this is really slow. And the dance stuff where it's like laughing, they're just telling jokes. You get to the second season, you've got head writer Jerry Joel in now, who gets the Muppets, and now it's more about the relationships. And then that's when it really becomes the Muppet Show. But nowadays, had you done that on Netflix, they would have gotten 12 episodes into the 26 episode run of season one, and Netflix would have been like, pull the plug on that. So, it used to be you had the benefit of time, and I just don't know that we have that benefit anymore on a lot of these projects. And I don't know how that shakes out creatively for a lot of people. It's got to be really tough.
Yeah, as you said, I firmly believe that Disney doesn't know what to do with the Muppets. And as we've talked about with the Grinch being one of those multi-generational, characters, you're not seeing that connection to the Muppets with younger generations because they haven't been able to leverage, that IP into something or they're not willing to let it breathe enough to do that. And I think that's a big reason why we didn't see more of that development of that area, because when you're talking about the theme park, especially, they're trying to gear things towards, like this is going to resonate with this audience, and the audience that the Muppets resonated with, especially those who saw, the original Muppet Show and such, and really grew up with the Muppets. In that, I like to say that the Muppets thrive in chaos, and I think that Disney a lot of times is so formulaic in a lot of ways that they have a hard time grappling with how to be successful with the Muppets. Yeah, and you can something like the Muppet Christmas Carol is a favorite, and that's something that it worked for, but that's not the kind of thing that is going to work all the time.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And the problem they're going to have, I mean, it's hard to believe, but, I think the last Muppet movie was almost 10 years ago now. And the Muppets are running on nostalgia gas. I mean, and it's like, you don't have the next generation being introduced to them. That's why, a lot of us older folks, we roll our eyes and we're like, really, we're going to do another Grinch movie just called The Grinch this time. That's like a secret. But that's brilliant in a way, because it keeps that character in front of the next generation. Like, we're like, didn't we already do that once with the 2003 Grinch? Well, yeah, but my 6-year-old hasn't seen it, or whatever. I don't have a 6-year-old, but I mean, it's like they haven't seen it. So it's brilliant that way to keep that IP out there. The Muppets, unfortunately, is getting to the point they have to rely so much on people our age, little bit younger, who are just like, I watch the show, I love these movies, you will love them too, but there's no new material coming out.
Right.
And that's when it gets really hard. And like I said, they have a great, they've got a great next generation of performers, and there are people just champing at the bit, I think, to get their hands on it. I just don't know how you break that wall between enthusiasm and Disney at that point. It's a shame, because I really do think that I can't think of her name right now, who has sort of oversight of the Muppet Studio, I think gets it. They didn't have that for a while, and I ran up against that a little bit when I was writing the Henson biography. Even there's like the for being children's entertainment, the House of Mouse has no sense of humor. And then I jumped right out of the frying pan into the fire. George Lucas sold his company to Disney right as I was starting that project. I was like, God damn it. But Disney's like, they're, with their IPs, they treat them really well. Or let me put it this way, they protect them really well, which is one of the reasons why Jim Henson wanted them there. But Disney's the dog that caught the car with that one. They're not quite sure what to do with them now that they've caught it. And they keep trying, and they even did it with they didn't own that one. I was gonna say Dark Crystal, but that was the Hensons on that one. But Netflix really didn't give that one the breathing room I think that one needed either. So it's just we are in, I sound like such an old crabby guy, but I sound like a Grinch. We are in such a time of immediate gratification on projects like this. Like, things have to immediately be huge, or they just pull the plug. And you've got Zaslav at Warner now, who's pulling projects that were already in the can. I would love to have seen the Wile E. Coyote movie that they just shelved forever. The Batgirl movie, stuff that they just can in the name of the bottom line. So I mean, you're really running into an era now where I think we're, and this would have frustrated Seuss, where the suits are driving the creative process, and that for those creatives was incredibly frustrating. It happened to George Lucas, happened to Seuss, it happened to some extent to Jim Henson, but man, Seuss just had no patience for, all these fingers in a project. It just really just gave him the willies.
All right. Well, hey, I want to thank you very much for taking the time. I know that, the holiday season is a very busy season, so I appreciate all the time that you have given us today. You've mentioned where we can find your works now. Is there anything that you are working on or that you have eyes on for the future?
So I have been working out for, this is the longest it's ever taken me on a project. Seuss came out in 19, and this will finally probably see the light of day in 26. I'm writing what I'm calling a biography of the U.S. Capitol building, which is a building that I worked in. I was a congressional staffer for about 8 years in the 90s, and worked for a U.S. senator and know that building very, very well. And it's never really been stood at the center of even really a history. But like I said, whether they want to call it a history biography, I'm calling it a biography. In my signature line on my Gmail account, it says capital an American biography. We'll see if that stays, but really trying to treat the building as a character. And what's been so much fun is every chapter seems to have a protagonist and an antagonist trying to just absolutely kill each other over who's going to get credit for things and whose plans are going to prevail, and politically who's on this side of it. So it's been a lot of fun. It's just taken me a lot longer than I anticipated it was going to take. So hopefully that'll be coming your way in the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So spring of 26, hopefully.
All right. Well, again, Brian, thank you very much for the time. I hope that you have a great holiday season and it isn't too Grinchy.
I hope not. And best to everybody in Springfield. Like I said, I spent quite a bit of time in Springfield while I was researching and writing this, and everybody there was really great. Your historical society there is fantastic. The library there is fantastic. So you guys are lucky to live in a real gem there. It's a great town.
Well, thanks very much, and have a great one.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank everybody for joining me for this episode. I thought that this was a lot of fun. This was a really insightful experience, especially talking with Brian about some of the aspects of the creation of this story and where it stands in terms of, Dr. Seuss's legacy, and how it ties in with the animated classic, and then later media that came out with Dr. Seuss and with the Grinch, and how it stays relevant these days. So very interesting conversation. Thank you very much to Brian. Also, thank you very much to Barbara Shaffer, who provided that information on kind of Ted's upbringing that I think added some good context for the conversation that I had with Brian. I would also love to thank all of you who have been listening and who have been supporting the podcast, either by buying us a blue milk, which you can do by going to our website, which helps with some of the small monetary costs that are associated with putting this together. I also, just everybody who's left a rating or a review or interacted with us on social media. It's the Maza's Musings podcast on Facebook. We're also on Twitter, which is X, and Threads and Instagram at Maza's Musings Pod. We are also on Blue Sky, and we are on TikTok at Maza's Musings Podcast. So there are lots of ways that you can interact with us. The best way to really support us is to interact with us, to leave those comments. You can leave comments on Spotify, and you can leave comments on Good Pods. And those are ways that you can interact directly with us. We also have, we love to interact with people. We love to get feedback from people. If you have an idea for a podcast, if you have an idea for a collaboration, if there's something you're like, hey, maybe you could do this instead of this, it's all good. We'd love to hear all of it. So thank you to everybody who has been supporting us, who has been sharing, and really word of mouth is the biggest way to help us out and to help us reach more people. We really enjoy having everybody. Honestly, we're trying to build a community here. And so the more people interact, the better it is for everybody. And the more people we can connect with, and really, as I've said over and over again, we're just trying to add a little fun to everybody's life, a little levity, maybe be a little bit informative. Maybe you walk away from an episode saying, hey, I didn't know that before. So, I mean, there are things about this one that I didn't know before about Dr. Seuss. So, as always, I just want to thank everybody for being a part of this, however you're doing it. And have a great weekend and a great week.